Hey guys, in this video I'll be taking a look back at arguably the most dominant Arnold Classic showing of all time, the 2001 Arnold Classic. With the Arnold coming up very soon, I thought that it would be fun to take a look at this show, since it is one of my favorite Arnolds ever, and showcased one of Ronnie Coleman's most impressive physiques during his career. Now, before we do dive into it, I want to give a quick shout out to my partner, Old School Labs. If you guys are interested in high quality supplements such as Blast Max pre-workout, which I do highly recommend, you can use my code JakeUltimate or check out the link in the description below. With that all being said, if you guys do enjoy these videos, a like and sub would be awesome and helps out the channel more than you think. And without any further ado, let's get into this video. Alright, here's the first pose, the front double biceps. This is one of the most iconic shots in bodybuilding, and immediately it sets the tone for who's bringing the best combination of size, symmetry, and condition. All three guys, Ronnie Coleman, Chris Cormier, and Dennis James, have completely different structures and physiques, which makes this a very interesting comparison. Starting with Ronnie Coleman in the center, it's pretty obvious why he dominated this contest even from the first pose. His arms in the shot are simply ridiculous. The sheer size of his biceps, the deep separation between the peaks, and the way his forearms flow perfectly into his upper arms makes them stand out even in a very competitive lineup. His delts are rounded and full even from the front, adding even more width to his frame. But the real game changer here has got to be the lats, which really flare out in an insane manner, creating that perfect V-taper that makes his waist, which is not the best body part, look pretty small. Speaking of that waist, Ronnie Coleman was never known for having the sharpest abs. However, his midsection still looks tight enough here to maintain the overall flow of the physique. And then there's, of course, the legs. The quads are straight up freaky. Not only are they massive, but the separation and overall details are crystal clear, especially on the inner thighs. It's one of those, front double bicep poses that really screams dominance and is easily one of the best of all time. Moving over to Chris Cormier on the left, you can see why he was always a pretty serious contender. His structure is plain different. He's got one of the best flows in bodybuilding history. His arms look great with very solid peaks and a more balanced shape compared to Ronnie, but they don't have the same density nor the same freak factor. His shoulders are wide and well-rounded, and his chest ties in nicely into the pose, making everything look clean upstairs. His waist is tighter than Ronnie's, which gives him a slightly more aesthetic look, but the biggest difference here has got to be in the legs. Chris has great quads, no doubt, but they just don't have the same wow factor as Ronnie Coleman. When you're standing next to one of the biggest and most conditioned freaks of all time, that's where the gap starts to show in this pose. Finally, on the right, we've got Dennis James, who's bringing some pretty serious mass to the table. His arms are absolutely monstrous, probably the fullest in the lineup, and his shoulders pop and his chest, even in this pose, looks pretty thick and dense. But unlike Ronnie and Chris, Dennis does have a much more compact structure, his lats don't create the same crazy V-taper, and his waist looks a little bit more blockier, I would say, which takes away from the overall shape of the pose. While his legs are huge, no doubt, they don't have the same deep cuts and definition that makes Ronnie's or even Chris's stand out. Just for some extra benefit, here's a second picture to show you that Dennis really isn't in the conversation here or at the same level as Ronnie or Chris when it comes to shape or structure. So, in my opinion, when it comes to this pose, this is a clear win for Ronnie. He's just got the best combination of size, condition, and structure. Chris brings a pretty aesthetic approach, but he lacks the detail to really challenge Ronnie. And Dennis, while pretty impressive from a size standpoint, doesn't quite have that taper or aesthetic flow to really compete with the other two in this pose. Now, let's move on to the front lat spread, a pose that really highlights who has the widest and most imposing upper body. The shot showcases lat width, chest fullness, shoulder width, as well as overall structure. And just like with the front double biceps pose, the camera angle here plays a huge role in how each competitor looks. Looking at the first image I've got for you guys, Dennis James really stands out. His chest and delts look incredibly full, and his lats spread out very widely, giving him a very dominant look. But we have to take into the account, the camera angle here. He's positioned in a way that favors his structure, making his frame look a little bit more exaggerated compared to the others. Meanwhile, Ronnie Coleman in the center looks plain freaky. His sheer size, density, and the insane level of grainy condition makes him look almost unreal. And in a weird way, the lower quality resolution of the photo actually enhances that effect. It makes his skin look paper thin, giving off that dry, grainy, almost alien-esque muscle detail that set him apart from everyone else. Chris Cormier on the left doesn't look bad by any means, but this particular angle is not favorable. He's got a tight waist, great balance, and full muscle bellies from what we can see, but his lats don't pop as much as they should because of how he's positioned in this picture. Even though he's clearly conditioned and full, this image does not capture the best version of his front lat spread. Now, here's a second shot, and this one gives us a much better look at Chris. From this angle, he really does look more balanced, and he stands out because of that. His lats spread wider, his structure looks more in proportion, and you can really appreciate just how aesthetic yet powerful his physique is. The camera isn't working against him anymore anyways, and suddenly he looks much more competitive. But now that we're seeing things from a more neutral perspective, Dennis James doesn't look as dominant. His fullness is still very impressive, as well as the sheer mass that he carries, but his waist appears a little bit wider, and his V-taper isn't as extreme as it looked in the first pose. This goes to show you just how much the camera angles can change the perception of a pose, which is why we obviously take a look at two of them here. As for Ronnie Coleman, well, he still looks absolutely insane. His lats are flaring out wide, his chest is bursting with fullness, and his legs still show the best combination of separation as well as that fullness in the lineup. Whether it's the first image or the second one, he's taking this pose hands down in my opinion. The combination of freak factor, size, and condition is simply too much for the other guys to match. Now, let's move on to the side chest pose, arguably the best pose to show off density and general thickness. Unfortunately, this is the only image we have of the pose of all three of them on the same stage, and the angle isn't the most ideal, but there's still plenty to break down. Right away, Ronnie Coleman in the center looks like an absolute tank. His pecs are bursting with size, and even though he's slightly turned downwards, you can still see the crazy striations and immense thickness that make his chest so dominant in this pose. His delts and, the arms as well are super dense and are shredded beyond belief, and then there's his lower body with the hamstrings and quad tie-in looking incredibly detailed, with even striations popping through those hamstrings even from this angle. Over on the left, Chris Cormier looks really good as well. He's got a pretty nice classic look in this pose, with a full well-shaped chest and great overall balance. His arms and shoulders tie in beautifully, and his hamstring detail is very much on point. The main issue here though is the camera positioning. It doesn't fully capture his waistline tightness, which could have made him appear even sharper. Maybe if he was captured at a better angle, it would have looked better. However, here it seems he was captured maybe at an unfavorable time, meaning that his waist wasn't cinched in properly. However, here it does look as if his waist is protruding ever so slightly. Then on the right we have Dennis James, who brings some very solid upper body development and overall thickness. He has some monstrous arms, rounded delts, and a huge side leg. However, this angle is also not that favorable. His chest seems sort of shallow, especially the near pec, and his entire physique lacks the same dryness or detail compared to the other two. Now, don't get me wrong, he looks very thick and dense. However, certain details are a bit washed out and leave a lot to be desired. But that said, I will say that, this picture obviously doesn't paint the entire picture, and had it been in higher quality or at a more favorable angle for all of these guys, it could have played out differently. That said, even with the odd angle, the rankings for this pose still seem pretty clear from this picture. Ronnie Coleman has the best combination of size, thickness, and detail, making him the clear winner in my mind. Chris Cormier looks very balanced and aesthetic, but this image doesn't do him that much justice. Dennis James has great roundness and fullness, but his structure doesn't flow as well as the other two, and his lower body isn't as sharp. So I would obviously have Ronnie Coleman winning, and Chris Cormier and Dennis James in a close second. However, I'd probably have Chris slightly ahead. The rear double biceps is one of the most important poses in bodybuilding. It's where champions are made and where shows are won. Now, this pose isn't just about back size, it's about detail, condition, proportion, and lower body development. And in this lineup, there's one clear truth, and that is that Ronnie Coleman is untouchable. Starting with Ronnie in the center, his back is really unreal. The sheer width, thickness, and deep separation between every muscle group in that back makes him look like he's from another planet. His traps form a perfect 3D pyramid of sorts, his lower lats insert ridiculously low, and his spinal erectors are thick and deeply separated. But what really separates him from the rest of the pack here is his conditioning. His skin looks paper thin, exposing every fiber and ridge in his back. And then we get to the legs, his glutes are strided to the extreme, and his hamstrings are deeply carved with insane separation. This is a textbook example of why Ronnie's back double was one of the best of all time, and here he is absolutely demolishing the lineup. To the left, though, we have Chris Cormier, who actually holds his own pretty well. He's got an extremely well-balanced back, with great width, strong lat insertions, and detailed traps. His arms also flow well into the pose, and his structure is obviously on point. But compared to Ronnie, the difference in the conditioning is stark. His back just isn't as crisp, and his hamstrings and glutes don't have the same deep separation. His shape is fantastic, no doubt, but at this level, fine details matter, and that's where Ronnie pulls ahead. On the right, we have Dennis James, who's bringing a very thick and dense look to the pose. His back is super round and full with massive delts and thick traps, but the biggest issue here for Dennis is in the lower back. His lats are wide and his upper back is pretty good, however his lower back is not as detailed or dense as Ronnie's or even Chris's. His legs are big and do have pretty good detail, probably the second best. However, against a guy like Ronnie, you really do need to be shredded to the bone and have a lot of freak factor to boot. Overall, Ronnie Coleman would win this one easily. His combination of size, detail, and ridiculous condition makes this pose a easy knockout. Chris Cormier looks very solid as well, with great shape and flow, but he doesn't have the conditioning downstairs to compete with Ronnie. Dennis does have massive thickness, but his lack of lower back detail and weaker structure put him in third place here. At the end of the day, this pose cements why Ronnie was nearly unbeatable in this era. His back was simply too dominant. If the rear double is the ultimate test of detail, then the rear lat spread is the ultimate test of width, thickness, and overall dominance. This is where bodybuilders' structural strengths and weaknesses are fully put on display, and once again, Ronnie Coleman proves why he was nearly untouchable. Looking at the first image I've got, the sheer density and width of Ronnie's back is just overwhelming. His lats flare out ridiculously wide, creating an insane V-taper that makes him look twice the size of his competitors. His traps and lower back are packed with deep separation, and his spinal erectors are thick and very well defined. Even in this picture, his conditioning is obvious. His glutes and hamstrings are fully cut up, showing off that next level sharpness that neither Chris nor Dennis have. Chris Cormier, standing to the left, actually has a really solid rear lat spread. His lats insert pretty nicely, and his shape is fantastic upstairs, probably the most aesthetic of the three. His width is also good, but it's not nearly as overpowering as Ronnie's. The biggest issue here, though, are that his legs don't have the same level of conditioning. His glutes and hamstrings aren't as deeply cut up, which takes away from the overall completeness of the pose. That said, his back is clearly the second best in my opinion, keeping him ahead of Dennis. Now, Dennis on the right does have some serious thickness, especially in the legs, but his back doesn't flow as well as the other two. He just doesn't have the same thickness in the lower back that you see in both Ronnie and Chris. I know this might sound a bit nitpicky, but his waist also looks blockier in the pose, which hurts his overall shape. However, I will say that his hamstrings and glutes are very sharp. While he's still a mass monster, this pose also really exposes his structural weaknesses compared to the other two. Now, looking at this second image, things become even clearer. Ronnie still looks absolutely dominant, and if anything, this image highlights his thickness even more. His back is just ridiculously dense. There's so much muscle packed into the traps, mid-back, and lats that it's hard to even find a weak point. His glutes are even more shredded, his hamstrings are fully separated, and his lower back is dialed in, proving that his conditioning was just on another level. For Chris, this image actually does help his case a little bit here. His lats do look a bit better, and you can also appreciate his beautiful structure even more. His taper is fantastic, and his width is very strong, but once again, his lack of sharpness in the lower body keeps him from truly challenging Ronnie. As for Dennis, we can see that this angle is not that favorable for him, probably worse than before, and you can even still notice that his lats are not as clean in terms of the lower back, which also lacks that detail and flow needed to beat Chris or Ronnie. While his lower body does have that crispy separation, which makes his physique look very impressive, the flow and general look don't impress me as much as the other two. His size is undeniable, but in this pose, the shape and lower back do hold him back. So, once again, Ronnie Coleman is the clear winner in this pose. His combination of width, thickness, and razor-sharp condition make this a pose that he dominates with ease. Chris Cormier would take second, as his lat structure and overall flow are great, but his lack of leg conditioning keeps him from challenging Ronnie, as well as the overall back development. Now, Dennis James, while undeniably thick, places third because his back lacks the overall development and detail, as well as the shape to a certain extent, to compete with the other two. I will say it is pretty close between him and Chris. However, at the end of the day, this pose reinforces why Ronnie's back was one of the most, unbeatable in bodybuilding history. His combination of size, structure, and conditioning were simply unmatched. The side tricep pose is usually a great test of tricep detail, overall arm development, waist control, and overall flow, but in this case, none of the competitors are really hitting it in a textbook manner. The camera angle and posing execution make it slightly difficult to judge, but based on what we can see, Chris Cormier would be taking this one right off the bat. Despite not hitting the pose conventionally, Chris Cormier's tight waist and very balanced structure make him the most visually pleasing in this pose. His midsection is razor sharp, and his flow from shoulders to the legs is the cleanest of the three. His tricep itself isn't bad either, though it's not as prominently displayed as it could be. However, when factoring in his overall shape and aesthetics, he edges out the win here, no doubt. Ronnie Coleman would come in second, I think, but just barely. His triceps are well feathered, and his conditioning is great as well, but his stance in the shot makes his waist appear slightly wider than usual. Now, I would attribute this to the camera angle, obviously. However, we all know that Ronnie Coleman was never the best in this pose. Still, his insane overall thickness and density help him out, and the deep separation in his quads and hamstrings add to this dominance as well. Even though he's not posing in the most textbook way, his conditioning and sheer mass keep him in the conversation. As for Dennis James, unfortunately, I think he would be taking third place. While the camera angle does not help him at all here, it actually does make his waist look even blockier than it would be. I would say that he, just doesn't flow as well, even from this angle, as a guy like Ronnie. While he undoubtedly does have that size and roundness, especially in the arms, his flow and proportions just don't look as good as they should or even could be. It's possible that with a more favorable camera position, he would have obviously looked a lot better, but the same could be said for all three of these guys. However, as it is from this one picture that we have, he really just doesn't have the same flow as Chris or the sharpness that Ronnie has. Now, this pose is far from perfect from any of them, and it's a shame that there's only one picture of it, but in my opinion, from what we can see, Chris Cormier's combination of a tight waist, great flow, and well-shaped triceps gives him the edge, even though he's not executing the pose traditionally. Ronnie Coleman's feathered triceps and immense thickness are enough to secure the second place, while Dennis James, due to his blockier waist and awkward posing angle, would take third, unfortunately. If this pose were hit properly by all three, the results might have been different, as well as if we had a better camera angle, but based on this specific image, I would say that Chris is taking it here. The ab and thigh pose is one of the most revealing shots in bodybuilding. It strips away the size advantages and puts the focus on the midsection sharpness, leg detail and flow, and overall X-frame. In this lineup, each competitor brings something unique, but Chris Cormier would get the edge here due to his superior balance, tight waist, and clean flow. Now, Chris Cormier looks fantastic, as I just mentioned. His midsection is tight, deeply cut, and well controlled, making his abs pop with great separation, and his serratus and obliques are also very well defined, which enhances his overall aesthetic. His quads might not be the freakiest in the lineup when it comes to sheer mass, but they are still very well shaped and flow naturally with his physique. The biggest reason he takes the win here is that his proportions are the most balanced. His waist stays tight and controlled, his abs remain prominent as well as the serratus and obliques, and his pose looks almost effortless. Between Ronnie and Dennis, the battle for second is sort of close. Ronnie has the bigger, wider silhouette, and his quads are significantly better, deeply separated, cut, and full. However, his midsection is the weakest in the lineup. His abs look soft and underdeveloped in comparison to the other two, and he lacks the tight control needed to dominate this pose. While his sheer size helps him in many of the other poses, here it actually works against him, as his thicker waist and a looser core control hurt his overall flow. Dennis James, on the other hand, has some very sharp and well-pronounced abs, the second best in the lineup in my opinion. His serratus and obliques are also very well defined, and his abs are deeply cut, and his midsection control is noticeably better than Ronnie's. However, his leg development is not as strong, and compared to Ronnie, his quads lack the same separation and detail, as well as that fullness, which makes his overall pose slightly less dominant than it could be. I will point out his noticeable hernia, which does add a little bit of protrusion to the midsection. However, the crispness and, the detail of his midsection is undeniable, and that is, in my opinion, enough to give him the slight edge over Ronnie, taking second. Now, this is a clear win for Chris Cormier, no doubt, as his balance, flow, and sharp midsection make him the most polished in this pose. The battle for second, while close, has Dennis James ultimately taking it by a very small margin due to his more defined and detailed abs, sharper obliques, and better midsection in general. Now, Ronnie, despite having the best quad separation and fullness as well, loses points due to his softer, less controlled midsection, making this one a slightly weaker pose for him. Well guys, that's about it for the pictures, as the most muscular was not a mandatory pose yet. Looking back at this lineup, Ronnie Coleman was the clear winner, as well as the deserving winner. His size, conditioning, and back dominance put him ahead in most of the poses, despite a few weaknesses in areas like the ab and thigh or side tricep. Chris Cormier had a strong showing, bringing the best balance of aesthetics and size, and he even managed to take a couple of the poses which favored aesthetics like the side triceps and ab and thigh, and Dennis James had his moments where he stood out, especially in terms of upper body roundness and midsection detail, but his structure and conditioning held him back from seriously challenging Ronnie or Chris. This was certainly one of the most dominant, if not the most dominant showings at the Arnold, and let me know your thoughts down below. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.